Chapter 12. Professor Umbridge. Seamus dressed at top speed next morning and left the dormitory before Harry had even put on his socks. Does he think he'll turn into a nutter if he stay in the room with me too long? Asked Harry loudly, as then hem of Seamus' robe whipped out of sight. Don't worry about it, Harry, Dean muttered, rested his school bag onto his shoulder. He just, but apparently he was unable to say exactly what Seamus was, and after a slightly awkward pause followed him out of the room. Neville and Ron both gave Harry "It's his problem, not yours" looks. But Harry was not much consoled. How much more of this was he going to have to take? "What's the matter?" asked Hermione 5 minutes later, catching up to Harry and Ron halfway across the common room as they all headed toward breakfast. "You look absolutely—" "Oh, for heaven's sake!" She was staring at the common room notice board where a large new sign had been put up. "Gallons of gallons. Pocket money falling to keep peace with your outgoing. Like to earn a little extra gold. Contract Fred and George Wesley, Gryffindor's common room for a simply part-time, virtually painless job. We regret that all work is undertaken at applications on risk. Yeah, the limit," said Hermione grimly, taking down the sign which Fred and George had pinned up over the poster giving the date of the first Hogsmeade weekend in October. "We'll have to talk to the Ron. Ron looked positively alarmed. "Why? Because we are perfect," said Hermione as they climbed out through the portrait hole. "It's up to us to stop this kind of thing." Ron said nothing. Harry could tell from his glum expression that the prospect of stopping Fred and George doing exactly what they like was not one that he found inviting. "Anyway, what's up, Harry?" Hermione continued, as they walked down a flight of stairs lined with portraits of old witches and wizards, all of whom ignored them, being engrossed in their own conversation. "You look really angry about something. Seamus reckon Harry's lying about you know who," said Ron succinctly. When Harry did not respond, Hermione, whom Harry had expected to react angrily on his behalf, sighed. "Yes, Lavender thinks so too," she said gloomily. "Been having a nice little chat with her about whether or not I'm a lying, attention seeking part. Have you?" Harry said loudly. "No," said Hermione calmly. "I told her to keep her big fat mouth shut about you, actually, and it would be quite nice if you stopped jumping down Ron's and my throats, Harry, because if you haven't noticed, we are on your side." There was a short pause. "Sorry," said Harry in a low voice. "That's quite all right," said Hermione with dignity. Then she shook her head. "Don't you remember what Dumbledore said at the end of the term feast last year?" Harry and Ron both looked at her blankly, and Hermione sighed again. "About you know who," he said, "his gift for spreading discord and enmity is very great. We can fight it only by showing an equal, strong bond of friendship and trust." "How do you remember stuff like that?" said Ron, looking at her in admiration. "I listen, Ron," said Hermione with a touch of aspiration. "So do I, but I still couldn't tell you exactly what. The point," Hermione pressed on loudly, "is that this sort of thing is exactly what Dumbledore was talking about. You know who has only been back 2 months and we have started fighting among ourselves, and the Sorting Hat's warning was the same: stand together, be united." "And Harry said it last night," retorted Ron. "If that means we are supposed to get Matty with the Slytherin fat chance." "Well, I think it's a pity we are not trying for a bit of inter-house unity," said Hermione crossly. They had reached the foot of the marble staircase. A line of fourth-year Ravenclaws was crossing the entrance hall. They caught sight of Harry and hurried to form a tighter group, as though frightened to might attack straggler. "Yeah, we really ought to be trying to make friends with people like that," said Harry sarcastically. They followed the Ravenclaws into the great hall, looking instinctively at the staff table as they entered. Professor Grubbly Plank was chatting to Professor Sinistra, the astronomy teacher, and Hagrid was once again conspicuous only by his absence. The enchanted ceiling above them echoed Harry's mood. It was a miserable, rainy, cloudy grey. Dumbledore didn't even mention how long that grubby plank woman's staying. He said as they made their way across the Gryffindor table. Maybe, said Hermione thoughtfully. What? Said both Harry and Ron together. Well, maybe he didn't want to draw attention to Hagrid not being here. What do you mean, draw attention to it? Said Ron, half laughing. How could we not notice? Before Hermione could answer, a tall black girl with long braided hair had marched up to Harry. Hi, Angelina. Hi, she said briskly. Good summer. And without waiting for an answer, listen, I have been made Gryffindor Quidditch captain. Nice one, said Harry, grinning at her. He suspected Angelina pep talk might not be as long-winded as Oliver Wood's had been, which could only be improvement. Yeah, well, we need a new keeper now, Olive left. Riot are on Friday at 5 o'clock and I want the whole team there, alright? Then we can see how the new person will fit in. Okay, said Harry, and she smiled at him and departed. I had forgotten Wood had left, said Hermione vaguely, sitting down beside Ron and pulling a plate of toast toward her. I suppose that will make quite difference to the team. I suppose, said Harry, taking the bench opposite. We was good keeper. Still, it won't hurt to have some new blood, will it? Said Ron. With a whoosh and a chattered hundred of owls came soaring in through a upper window. They descended all over the hall, bringing litter and packages to their owners, and showering the breakfast with droplets of water. It was clearly raining hard outside. Hedwig was nowhere to be seen, but Harry was hardly surprised. His only correspondent was Cyrus, and he doubted Cyrus would have anything new to tell him after only 24 hours apart. Hermione, however, had to move her orange juice aside quickly to make way for a large dumb barn owl bearing a sodden daily prophet in its beak. What are you still getting that for? Said Harry irritably, thinking of Seamus as Hermione placed a nut in the leather pouch in the owl's leg and it took off again. I'm not bothering. Lots of rubbish. It's best to know what the enemies are saying, said Hermione darkly, and she unfurled the newspaper and disappeared behind it, not emerging until Harry and Ron had finished eating. Nothing, she said simply, rolling up the newspaper and laying it down by her plate. Nothing about you or Dumbledore or anything. Professor McGonagall was now moving along the table, handling out schedule. Look at today, Grand Ron, History of Magic, Double Potion, Deviation, and Double Defense against the Dark Arts. Bin Snape, Trelawney, and that Umbridge woman all in one day. I wish Fred and George had hurry up and get those skiving snack box sorted. Do mine ear deceives me, said Fred, arriving with George and squeezing onto the bench beside Harry. Hogwarts perfect, surely don't wish to skew off lessons. Look what we have got today, said Ron grumpily, shoving the schedule under Fred's nose. That's the worst Monday I have ever seen. Fair point, little bro, said Fred, scanning the column. You can have a bit of nozzleblade knotted chip of you like. I ate cheap, said Ron suspiciously, because you'll keep bleeding till you shrived up. We haven't got an antidote yet, said George, helping himself to a kipper. Cheers, said Ron moodily, poking his schedule. But I think I'll take the lesson. And speaking of yours, giving snack box, said Hermione, eyeing Fred and George Bedily, you can't advertise for testers on the Gryffindor notice board. Says who? Said George, looking astonished. Says me, said Hermione. And Ron. Leave me out of it, said Ron hastily. Hermione glared at him. Fred and George sniggered. You'll be singing a different tune soon enough, Harmony, said Fred, thinking buttering a crumpet. You are starting your fifth year, you'll be begging us for a snack box before long. And why would starting fifth year mean I want a giving snack box? Asked Harmony. 50 years, owl years, said George. So you have got your exam coming up, haven't you? They'll be keeping your noses so hard to that grindstone they'll be rubbed raw, said Fred with satisfaction. Half our year had minor breakdown coming up to owls, said George happily, tears and tantrums. Patricia Stimponson kept coming over faint. Nathan Towers came into in boil. Do you remember? Said Fred reminiscently. That's cause you put Bulbax powder in his pajamas, said George. Oh yes, said Fred, grinning. I had forgotten. Hard to keep track something, isn't it? Anyway, it's a nightmare of a year. The fifth, said George. If you care about exam result anyway, Fred and I managed to keep our spirits up somehow. Hey, you got, what was it? 3 owls each, said Ron. Yep, said Fred unconcernedly. But we feel our future lie outside the world of academic achievement. We seriously debated whether we are going to bother coming back for our seventh year, said George brightly. Now that we have got, we broke off at a warning look from Harry, who knew George had been about mention the Triwizard winning he had given them. Now that we have got our owls, George said hastily, I mean, do we really need NEWTs? But we didn't think Mum would take us leaving school early, not on top of Percy's turning out to be the world's biggest brat. We're not going to waste our last chance here, though, said Fred, looking affectionately around at the Great Hall. We are going to use it to do a bit of market research, find out exactly what the average Hogwarts student requires from his jokes shop, carefully evaluate the result of our research, and the produce the products to feed the demand. But where are you going to get the gold to start a joke shop? Asked Harmony skeptically. You are going to need all the ingredients and materials and premises too, I suppose. Harry did not look at the twins. His face felt not the deliberately drop his fork and divide down to retrieve it. He heard Fred say overhead, ask us no question and we'll tell you no lies. Harmony, come on, George. If we get there early, we might be able to sell a few extendable year before herbology. Harry emerged from under the table to see Fred and George walking away, each carrying a stack of toast. What did that mean? Said Hermione, looking from Harry to Ron. Ask us no question. Does that mean they have already got some gold to start a joke shop? You know, I have been wondering about that, said Ron, his brow furrowed. They brought me a new set of dress robe this summer, and I couldn't understand where they got the gallons. Harry decided it was time to steer the conversation out of these dangerous waters. Do you reckon it's true this year is going to be really tough because of the exam? Oh, yes, said Ron. Bound to be, isn't it? Owls are really important, affect the jobs you can apply for the everything. We get career advice too later this year. Bill told me, so you can choose what NEWTs you want to do next year. Do you know what you want to do after Hogwarts? Harry asked the others too, as they left the Great Hall shortly afterward and set off toward the History of Magical classroom. Not really, said Ron slowly, except, well, we look slightly sheepish. What? Harry urged him. Well, it had be cool to be an aurora, said Ron in an offhand voice. Yeah, it would, said Harry fervently. But they are like the elite, said Ron. You have got to be really good. What about you, Harmony? I don't know, said Hermione. I think I'd really like to do something worthwhile. An auror's worthwhile, said Harry. Yes, it is, but it's not the only worthwhile thing, said Hermione thoughtfully. I mean, if I would take SPW further, Harry and Ron carefully avoided looking at each other. History of magic was, by common consent, the most boring subject ever devised by wizard kind. Professor Beans, their ghost teacher, had a wheezy droning voice that was, among us, guaranteed to pause several runways within 10 minutes. 5 in warm weather, he never varied the form of their lesson but lectured them without pausing while they looked noted or rather gazed sleepily into space. Harry and Ron had so far managed to scrape past in these subjects only by copying Hermione's note before exam. She alone seemed able to resist the soporific power of Bin's voice. Today they suffered through 3 quarters of an hour's droning on the subject of giant wars. Harry heard just enough within the first 10 minutes to appreciate dimly what, in another teacher's hand, this subject might have been mildly interesting, but then his brain de-engaged and he spent the remaining 35 minutes playing hangsman on a corner of his parchment with Ron while Hermione shot them 50 look out of the corner of her eye. How will it be? She asked them coldly as they left the classroom for break, Bins drifting away through the backboard. If I refuse to lend you my noted this year's, we had failed our owls, while Ron said, if you want that on your conscience, Hermione, well, you had deserved it, she snapped. You don't even try to listen to him, do you? We do try, said Ron. We just haven't got your brains or your memory or your concentration. You're just cleverer than we are. Is it nice to rub it in? Oh, don't give me that rubbish, said Hermione, but she looked slightly mollified as she led the way out into the damp courtyard. A fine misty drizzle was falling, so that the people standing in huddle around the yard looked blurred at the edge. Harry, Ron, and Hermione chose a scheduled corner under a heavily dripping balcony, turning up the collar of their robes against the chilly September air and talking about what Snape was likely to set them in the first lesson of the year. They had got as far as agreeing what it was likely to be something extremely difficult just to catch them off guard after a 2 month holiday when someone walked around the corner toward them. Hello, Harry. It was Cho Chang, and what was more, she was on her own again. This was most unusual. Cho was almost always surrounded by a gang of giggling girls. Harry remembered the agony of trying to get her by herself to ask her to the Yule ball. Hi, said Harry, feeling his face grown hot. At least you are not covered in Skip's cap this time, he told himself. Charles seemed to be thinking along the same line. You got that stuff up then? Yes, said Harry, trying to grin as though the memory of his this last meeting was funny as opposed to mortifying. So did you have a good summer? The moment he said this, he wished he didn't. Cedric had been Charles' boyfriend, and the memory of his date must have been affected her holiday almost as badly as it had affected Harry's. Something seemed to be rotten in her face, but she said, oh, it was all right, you know. Is that a tornado badge? Ron demanded, suddenly pointing at the front of Charles' robe, to which a sky blue badge emblazoned with a double gold T was pinned. You don't support them, do you? Oh, I do, said Tom. Have you always supported them, or just since they started winning the league? Said Ron in what Harry considered not necessarily I have have supported them since I was 6, said Chow coolly. Anyway, see you, Harry. She walked away. Hermione waited until Chow was halfway across the courtyard before rounding on Ron. You are so tactless. But I only asked her if couldn't you tell she wanted to talk to Harry on her own, so she could have done. I wasn't stopping. What on earth were you attacking her about her Quidditch team for? Attacking? I wasn't attacking her. I was only. Who cares if she supports the tornadoes? So come on, half the people you see wearing those badges only bought them last season. But what does it mean? It means they are not really fans, they are just jumping on the bandwagons. That's the whale, said Harry listlessly, because Ron and Hermione were bickering too loudly to hear. They did not stop arguing all the way down to Snape's dragon, which gave Harry plenty of time to reflect that between Neville and Ron, he would be lucky ever to have 2 minutes conversation with Chow that he could look back on without wanting to leave the country. And yet, he thought, as they joined the queue lining up outside Snip's classroom door, she had chosen to come and talk to him. Hadn't she? She had been Cedric's girlfriend. She couldn't easily have hated Harry for coming out of the Triwizardy maze alive when Cedric had died. Yet she was talking to him in a perfectly friendly way, not as though she thought him mad or a liar or in some horrible way responsible for Cedric's death. Yes, she had definitely chosen to come and talk to him, and that made the second time in 2 days. And at this thought, Harry's spirit rose. Even the ominous sound of Snape's dragon door cracking open did not puncture the small, hopeful bubble that seemed to have swollen in his chest. He filed into the classroom behind Ron and Hermione and followed them to their usual table at the back, ignoring the huffy, irritable noise now issuing from both of them. Settle down, said Snape coldly, shutting the door behind him. There was no real need for the cop to order the moment the class had heard the door close. White had fallen, and all fighting stopped. Snip's mere presence was usually enough to ensure a class silence. Before we begin today's lesson, said Snip, sweeping over to his desk and staring around all, I think it appropriate to remind you that next June you will be sitting an important examination during which you will prove how much you have learned about the composition and use of magical potion. Moronic though some of these class undoubtedly are, I expect you to scrap an acceptable in your owl or suffer my displeasure. His gaze leaned this upon Neville, who gulped. After this year, of course, many of you will cease studying with me. Snape went on. I take only the very best into my new potion class, which means that some of us will certainly be saying goodbye. His eye rested on Harry and his lip curled. Harry glared back, feeling a grim pleasure at the idea that he would be able to giving up potion after 50 years. But we have another year to go before that happy moment of farewell, said Snape softly. So whether you are intending to attempt NEWT or not, I advise all of you to concentrate your efforts upon maintaining the high pass level I have come to expect from my owl students. Today, we will be maximizing a potion that often come up at ordinary wizarding level. The Draught of Peace, a potion to calm anxiety and soothe agitation. Reward, if you are too heavy-handed with ingredients, you will put the drinker into a heavy and something irresistible sleep. So, you will need to pay close attention to that you are doing. On Harry's left, Hermione sat up a little straighter, her expression one of the utmost attentiveness. The ingredients and methods Snape flicked his wand are on the blackboard. They appear there. You will find everything you need. He flicked his wand again. in the stout cupboard. The door of the said cupboard sprang open. You have an hour and a half start. Just as Harry, Ron, and Hermione had predicted, Snape could hardly have set them a more difficult, fiddly potion. The ingredients had to be added to the cauldron in precisely the lightest order and quantities. The mixture had to be stirred exactly the right number of times, firstly in clockwise, then in counterclockwise direction. The heat of the flame on which it was simmering had to be lowered to exactly the right level of the specific number of minutes before the final ingredient was added. A light silver vapor should now be rising from your potion or snip with 10 minutes left to go. Harry, who was sweating profusely, looked desperately around the Diggons. His was cauldron was issuing copious amount of dark grey steam. Ron's was spitting green sparks. Seamus was feverishly prodding a flame at the base of his cauldron, which the tip of his wand as they had gone out. The surface of Hermione's potion, however, was a shimmering mist of silver vapor, and as Snape swept by, the looked down his punked nose at it without comment, which meant that he could find nothing to criticize. At Harry's cauldron, however, Snape stopped, looking down at Harry with a horrible smirk on his face. Potter, what is this supposed to be? The Slytherin at the front of the class all looked up eagerly. They looked, hearing Snape taunt Harry. The draught of peace, said Harry tensely. Tell me, Potter, said Snape softly, can you read? Draco Malfoy read. Yes, I can, said Harry, in finger clinging tightly around his wand. Read the third line of an instruction for me, Potter. Harry squinted at the blackboard. It was not easy to make out the instruction through the haze of multicolored steam now falling the Dagon. Add powdered moonstone stirred 3 times counterclockwise, allowed to simmer for 7 minutes, then add 2 drops of syrup to hellebore. His heart sank. He had not added syrup of hellebore, but had proceeded straight to the fourth line of the instruction after allowing his potion to simmer for 7 minutes. Did you do everything on the third line, Potter? No, said Harry very quietly. I beg your pardon. No, said Harry more loudly. I forgot the hellebore. I know you did, Potter, which means that this maze is utterly worthless. Avasco. The content of Harry's potion vanished. He was left standing foolishly beside an empty cauldron. Those of you who have managed to read the instruction, fill one flagon with a sample of your potion, label it clearly with your names, and bring it up to my desk for testing, said Snape. Homework. Roll inch of parchment on the properties of moonstone and its uses in potion making to be added in on Thursday. While everyone around him filled their flagons, Harry cleared away his things, stitching. This potion had been no worse than Ron's, which was now giving off a full odor of bad eggs, or Neville's, which had achieved a consistency of just mixed cement, and which Neville was now having a gulp out of his cauldron, yet it was he, Harry, who had to be receiving 0 mark for day's work. He stuffed his wand back into his bag and slumped down into his seat, watching everyone else march up to Snape's desk with filled and crooked flagon. When at long last the bell rang, Harry was first out of Dagon's and had already started to lunch by the time Ron and Hermione joined him in Great Hall. The ceiling was turned an even murkier grey during the morning. Rain was slashing the high window. That was really unfair, said Hermione consolingly, sitting down next to Harry and helping herself to spared pie. Your potion wasn't nearly as bad as Goyle's. When he put it in his flagon, the whole thing shattered and set his robe on fire. Yeah, well, said Harry, glorying at his plate, since when has Snape ever been fair to me? Neither of the others answered. All three of them knew that Snape and Harry mutually had been absolute from the moment Harry had set foot in Hogwarts. I did think he might be bitter this year, said Hermione in a disappointing voice. I mean, you know. She looked carefully around. There were half a dozen empty seats on either side of them, and nobody was passing the table. Now he's in the order of everything. Poisonous toadstool don't change their spots, said Ron saggily. Anyway, I have always thought Dumbledore was that trusting Snape. Where is the evidence? He every really stopped working for you know who. I think Dumbledore's probably got plenty of evidence, even if he doesn't share it with you, Ron snapped Hermione. Oh, shut up. Pair of you, said Harry heavily, as Ron opened his mouth to argue back. Hermione and Ron both froze, looking angry and offended. You give it a rest, he said, you are always having to go at each other. It's driving me mad. And abandoning his spearhead pie, he swung his school bag back over his shoulder and left them sitting there. He walked up marble staircase to step at the time past the many students hurrying toward lunch. The anger that had just flared so unexpectedly still blazing inside him, and the vision of Ron and Hermione's shocked face afforded him a sense of deep satisfaction. Served them right, he thought. Why can't they give it rest? Drink all the time, it's enough to drive anyone up the hall. He passed the large picture of Sir Cadogan and Knight of the Landing. Sir Cadogan drew his sword and brandished it fiercely at Harry, who ignored him. Come back, you scurvy dog, stand fast and fight, yelled Sir Cadogan in muffled voice from behind his visitor, but Harry merely walked on. And when Sir Dagon attempted to follow him by running into a neighboring picture, he was doubled by its inhabitant, a large and angry-looking wolfhound. Harry spent the rest of lunch hour sitting alone underneath the trapdoor at the top of North Tower, and consequently he was the first to ascend the silver ladder that led to Cyber Traveler's classroom. When the bell rang, Deviation was Harry's first favorite class after Potion, which was due mainly to Professor Tramway's habit of predicting his permanent death every few lessons. A thin woman, heavily draped in shawl and glitter with string of beads, she always reminded Harry of some kind of instinct which her glasses, usually magnifying her eyes. She was busy putting copies of battered leather-bound book of each of the spindly little table with which her room was littering when Harry entered the room, but so dim was the light cast by the lamp covered by shelves and the low burning stick scented fire that she appeared not to notice him as he took a seat in shadow. The rest of the class arrived over next 5 minutes. Ron emerged from the trapdoor, looked around carefully, spotted Harry, and made direction for him as directly as he could while having to wend his way between table, chair, and walls of books. Hermione and me have stopped arguing, he said, sitting down beside Harry. Good, grunted Harry, but Hermione says she thinks it will be nice if you stop talking out your temper on us, said Ron. I am not. I'm just passing on the messages, said Ron, talking over him, but I reckon she is right. It's not our fault how Seamus and Snape treat you. I never said it. Good day, said Professor Trenway in her usual misty, dreamy voice, and Harry broke off, feeling both annoyed and slightly ashamed of himself again. And welcome back to Deviation. I have, of course, been following your fortune most carefully over the holidays, and I am delighted to see that you have all returned to Hogwarts safely, as of course I knew you would. You will find on the table before you copies of the Dream Oracles by Inigo Imago, Dream interpretation is a most important mean of dividing the future and one that many may very probably be rested in your owl. Not, of course, that I believe examination, pass or failure are of the remotest important when it comes to the scared art of deviation. If you have the saying I certificate and graded matter very little. However, the headmaster like you to sit the examination so her voice trailed away delicately, leaving them all in no doubt that Professor Trailway considered her subject above such sordid matter of examination. Turn please to the introduction and read what Imago had to say on the matter of dream interpretation. The divide into pair use the dream oracle to interpret each other's most recent dream. Carry on. The one good thing to be said for this lesson was that it was not a double period. By the time they had all finished reading the introduction of the book, they had barely 10 minutes left for dream interpretation. At the table next to Harry and Ron, Dean had paired up the Neville, who immediately embarked on a long, winding explanation. A nightmare involving a pair of giant scissors wearing his grandmother's best hat. Harry and Ron merely looked at each other gloomily. I never remembered my dream, said Ron. You say one, must remember one of them, said Harry impatiently. He was not going to share his dreams with anyone. He knew perfectly well that his regular nightmare about the graveyard meant he did not need Ron and Professor Telway or the stupid dream oracle to tell him what that. Well, I had one that I was playing fetch the other night, said Ron, screwing up his face in the effort to remember. What do you reckon that means? Probably that you are going to be eaten by a giant marshmallow or something, said Harry, turning the page of the dream oracle without interest. It was very dull work looking up bits of dream in the oracle, and Harry was not cheered up when Professor Chalway set them the task of keeping a dream diary for a month as a homework. When the bell went, he and Ron led the way back down the ladder, Ron gluming loudly. Do you realize how much homework we have got ready? Been set us foot and half long essay on giant warps, snap one, a foot of the use of moonstones, and now we have got a dreamy diary from Railway. Fred and George weren't wrong about owls here, were they? The Umbridge women had better not give us any. When they entered Defense Against the Dark Art classroom, they found Professor Umbridge already seated at the teacher's desk, wearing the fluffy pink cardigan of the night before and the black velvet bow on top of her head. Harry was again reminded forcibly of the large fly perched unwittingly on the top of an even large toad. The class was quiet as it entered the room. Professor Umbridge was as yet as a known quantity, and nobody knew yet how strict or disciplinary she was like to be. Well, good afternoon, she said when finally the whole class had sat down. A few people mumbled good afternoon in reply. But, said Professor Umbridge, that won't do. Now, will it? I should like you please to reply good afternoon, Professor Umbridge. One more time, please. Good afternoon, class. Good afternoon, Professor Umbridge. They chanted back at her. There now, said Professor Umbridge sweetly. That wasn't too difficult, was it? Wand away and quills out, please. Many of the class exchanged gloomy look. The order what way had never been followed by a lesson they had found interesting. Harry showed his wand back inside the bag and pulled out quill ink and parchment. Professor Umbridge opened her handbag, extracted her own wand, which was an unusually short one, and tapped the blackboard sharply with word appear on the board at once. Defense against the dark art, a return or to basic principle. Well, now your teaching in this subject has been rather disturbed and fragmented, hasn't it? Stated Professor Umbridge, turning to face the class with her hand clapped neatly in front of her. The constantly changing of teachers, many of whom do not seem to have followed any ministry approved curriculum, has unfortunately resulted in your being far below to the standard we would expect to see in your house year. You will be pleased to know, however, that these problems are now to be rectified. We will be following a careful structure Ministry approved course of defensive magics this year. Copy down the following please. She rapped the blackboard again. The first message vanished and was replaced by causes EMs. And first, understanding the principle underlining defensive magic. Second, learning to recognize situation in which defensive magic can legally be used. 3. Placing the use of defensive magic in a context of far practical use. For a couple of minutes, the room was fulfilled of the sound of scratching quill on the parchment. When everyone had copied down Professor Umbridge's three-course EM, she said, "Has everybody got a copy of Defensive Magical Theory by Wilbur Littlewood?" There was a dull murmur of assent throughout the class. "I think we'll try that again," said Professor Umbridge. "When I ask you a question, I should like you reply yes, Professor Umbridge, or no, Professor Umbridge." So, has everyone got a coffee? Defensive Magical Theory by Wilbur II. Yes, Professor Umbridge rang through the room. Good, said Professor Umbridge. I should like you to return to page 5 and read chapter 1, Basic for Beginners. There will be no need to talk. Professor Umbridge left the blackboard and settled herself in the chair behind the teacher's desk, observing them all with those pouchy toad eyes. Harry turned to page 5 of his copy of Defensive Magical Theory and started to read. It was desperately dull, quite as bad as listening to Professor Beans. He felt his concentration sliding away from him. He had soon read the same line half a dozen times without taking in more than the first few words. Several silent minutes passed next to him. Ron was absent-mindedly turning his quill over and over his finger, staring at the same spot on the page. Harry looked slightly and received a surprise to shake him out of the torpor. Hermione had not even opened her copy of Defensive Magical Theory. She was staring fixedly at Professor Umbridge with her hand in the air. Harry could not remember Hermione ever neglecting to read when instructed to, or indeed resisting to temptation to open any book that came under her nose. He looked at her questioningly, but she merely shook her head slightly to indicate that she was not about to answer question, and continued to stare at Professor Umbridge, who was looking just as resolutely in another direction. After several more minutes had passed, however, Harry was not the only one watching Hermione. The chapter they had been instructed to read was so tedious that more and more people were choosing to watch Hermione's mute attempt to catch Professor Umbridge's eye that to struggle on the basic for beginners. When more than half the class were staring at Hermione rather than their books, Professor Umbridge seemed to decide that she could ignore the situation no longer. "Did you want to ask something about the chapter, dear?" she asked Hermione as though she had not just noticed her. "Not about the chapter, no," said Hermione. "Well, we are reading just now," said Professor Umbridge, showing her small pointing teeth. "If you have other queries, we can deal with them at the end of class." "I have got a query about your course, CM," said Hermione. Professor Umbridge raised her eyebrow. "And your name is Hermione Granger," said Hermione. "Well, Miss Granger, I think the course CM are perfectly clear if you read them through carefully," said Professor Umbridge in a voice of determined sweetness. "Well, I don't," said Hermione bluntly. "There is nothing written up there about using defensive spell." There was a short silence in which many members of the class turned their head to frown at the three-course CM still written on the blackboard. "Using defensive spell," Professor Umbridge repeated with a little laugh. "Why, I can't imagine any situation arising in my classroom that would require you to use defensive spells." Miss Granger, you surely aren't expecting to be attacking during class. We are not going to use magic. Ron ejaculated loudly. Students raised their hand when they wished to speak in my class, Mr. Weasley, said Ron, thrusting his hand into ear. Professor Umbridge, smiling still more widely, turned her back on him. Harry and Hermione immediately raised their hand too. Professor Umbridge's pouch eye lingered on Harry for a moment before she addressed Hermione. Yes, Miss Granger, you wanted to ask something, yes? Yes, said Hermione. Surely the whole point of defensive against the dark art is to practice defensive spell. Are you a ministry trained educational expert? Miss Granger asked Professor Umbridge in her falsely sweet voice. No, but well then I'm afraid you are not qualified to decide what the whole point of uh, any class is. Wizard much older and clever than you have devised our new programs of study. You will be learning about defensive spell in a secure, risk-free way. What use is that? Said Harry loudly. If you are going to be attacked, it won't be in and Mr. Potter, sang Professor Umbridge. Harry thrust his fist in the air. Professor Umbridge promptly turned away from him again, but now several other people had their hand up too. And your name is Professor Umbridge, said to Dean. Dean Thomas. Well, Mr. Thomas. Well, it's like Harry said, isn't it? Said Dean. If we are going to be attacked, it won't be risk free. I repeat, said Professor Umbridge, smiling in every irritating fashion at Dean. Do you expect to be attacked during my class? No, but Professor Umbridge talked over him. I do not wish to criticize the way things have been run in the school, she said, an unconvincing smile stretching her wide mouth. But you have been exposed to some very irresponsible wizards in this class, very irresponsible indeed, not to mention she gave a nasty little laugh, extremely dangerous half-breed. If you mean Professor Lupin, piped up Dean Thomas angrily, he was the best we ever. And Mr. Thomas, as I was saying, you have been introduced to spells that have been complex, inappropriate to your age group, and potentially lethal. You have been frightened into belief that you are little to mid dark art every other day. Now we haven't, said Harmony. We are just your hand is not up, Miss Granger. Harmony put her hand. Professor Umbridge turned away from her. It is my understanding that many producers not only performed illegal cures in front of you, he actually performed them on you. Well, he turned out to be Manica, didn't he? Said Dean Thomas hotly. Mind you, we still learn lots. Your hand is not up, Mr. Thomas, still Professor Umbridge. Now it is the view of ministry that theoretically knowledge will be more than sufficient to get you through your examination, which after all is that what school is about. And your name is, she added, staring at Parvati, whose hand had just sort of Parvati Patil. And isn't there a practical bit in our defense against the dark art owls? Aren't we supposed to show that we can actually do the counter course and things? As long as you have studied the theory hard enough, there is no reason why you should not be able to perform the spell under careful control examination conditions, said Professor Umbridge dismissively. Without your practicing then before, said Parvati incredulously. Are you telling us that the first time we'll get to do the spell will be during our exam? I repeat, as long as you have studied the theory hard enough, and what good's going theory going to be in the real world? Said Harry loudly, his first in the year again. Professor Umbridge looked up. This is school, Mr. Potter, not the real world, she said softly. We are not supposed to be prepared for what waiting out there. There is nothing waiting out there, Mr. Potter. Oh yes, said Harry, his temper seemed to have been running just within the surface reaching boiling point. Who do you imagine want to attack children like yourself? Inquired Professor Umbridge in an horrible, haunted voice. Let's sing, said Harry in a more powerful voice. Maybe Lord Voldemort. Ron gasped. Lavender Brown uttered in little steam. Neville slipped sideways off his stool. Professor Umbridge, however, did not flinch. She was staring at Harry with a grimy, satisfied expression on her face. 10 points from Gryffindor, Mr. Potter. The classroom was silent and still everyone was staring at either Umbridge or Harry. Now, let me make a few things quite plain. Professor Umbridge stood up and leaned forward, then her stubby-fingered hand played on her desk. You have been told that a certain dark wizard has returned from the dead. He wasn't dead, said Harry angrily, but he is returned. Mr. Potter, you have already lost your house 10 points. Do not make matter worse for yourself, said Professor Umbridge in one breath without looking at him. As I was saying, you have been informed that certain dark wizard in is at large once. This is a lie. It's not a lie, said Harry. I saw him. I fought him. Detention, Mr. Potter, said Professor Umbridge triumphantly. Tomorrow's evening, 5 o'clock, my office. I repeat, this is a lie. The Ministry of Magic guaranteed that you are not in danger from the Dark Wizard. If you are still worried, by all means come and see me outside class hours. If someone is alarming you with fibs about Reborn Dark Wizard, I would like to hear about it. I am here to help. I am your friend. And now you will kindly continue your reading page 5 basic for beginners. Professor Umbridge sat down behind the desk. Again, Harry, however, stood up. Everyone was staring at him. Seamus looked half scared, half fascinated. Harry, no, Hermione whispered in the warning voice, tugging at his sleeves, but Harry jerked his arm out of her reach. So, according to you, Cedric Diggory dropped dead of his own accord, did he? Harry asked, his own shaking voice. There was a collective intake of breath from the class, for none of them, apart from Ron and Hermione, had ever heard Harry talk about what had happened on the night that Cedric had died. They stared wildly from Harry to Professor Umbridge, who had raised her eye and was staring at him without a trace of a fake smile on her face. Cedric Diggory's death was a tragic accident, she said coldly. It was murder, said Harry. He could feel himself shaking. He had hardly taken to anyone about this list. All 30 eagerly listened. Classmate, Voldemort killed him, and you know it. Professor Umbridge's face was quite blank. For a moment, he thought she was going to scream at him. Then she said, in her softest, most sweetly girlish voice, come here, Mr. Potter, dear. He clicked his chair aside, strode around Ron and Hermione, and up to the teacher's desk. He could feel the rest of the class holding its breath. He felt so angry he did not care what happened next. Professor Umbridge pulled a small roll of pink parchment out of her handbag, stretched it out of the desk, gripped her quill into the bottle of ink, and started scribbling hunched over so that Harry could not see what she was writing. Nobody spoke. After a minute or so, she rolled up parchment and tapped it with her hand. It sealed itself seamless so that it could not open it. Take this to Professor McGonagall, dear, said Professor Umbridge, holding out the note to him. He took it from her without saying a word and left the room, not even looking back at Ron and Hermione, and slamming the door shut behind him. He walked very fast along the corridor, the note to McGonagall clutched tight in his hand, and turned a corner walk, slapped his hand, and turning to corner walk into Pius and Maltese, a white-faced little man floating on his back in midair, jungling several ink balls. While Potter reporter tackled Pius, allowing two of the inkwells to fall to the ground, where they smashed the square stacked wall into ink. Harry jumped backward out of the way with a sneer. Get out of it, Pius. Oops, crackpot, feeling khaki, said Pius, pursuing Harry along the corridor, learning as they zoomed along above. What is it this time, my fine Potter's friend? Hearing voice, seeing visions, speaking in Pius blue, gigantic raspberry tongue. I said, leave me alone, Harry shouted, running down the nearest flight of stairs. But Pius merely slid down the banister of his back. Him almost think he is barking. OTV lad, but some are more kindly and think he just had. But Pius knows better and says that he's mad. Shut up! The door of his lab flew open and Professor McGonagall emerged from her office, looking grim and slightly harassed. What on earth are you shouting about, Potter? She snapped as Pius crackled, glared, and zoomed out of sight. Why aren't you in the class? I have been sent to you, said Harry sniffly. Sent? What do you mean sent? She held out of the note from Professor Umbridge. Professor McGonagall took it from him, throwing slight open with the tap of her wand stretching into out and began to read. Her eyes zoomed from side to side behind this square spectacle as she read that Umbridge had written, and with each line they become narrower. Come in here, Potter. He followed her inside her study. The door closed automatically behind him. Well, said Professor McGonagall, rounding on him. Is this true? Is what true? Harry asked rather more aggressively than he had intended. Professor added in an attempt to sound more polite. Is it true that you shouted at Professor Umbridge? Yes, said Harry. You called her a liar? Yes. You told her you know who must not be named is back? Yes. Professor McGonagall sat down behind her desk, calling at Harry. Then she said, have a biscuit, Potter. Have what? Have a biscuit, she repeated impatiently, indicating a torrent of a cookie lying on the top of one of the pile of paper on her desk, and sit down. There had been a previous occasion when Harry, expecting to be canned by Professor McGonagall, had insisted been appointed by her to the Gryffindor Quidditch team. He sank into the chair opposite her and helped himself to a ginger nut, feeling just as confused and wrong-footed as he had done on what occasion. Professor McGonagall sat down Professor Umbridge's note and looked very seriously at Harry. Potter, you need to be careful. Harry swallowed his mouthful of ginger nut and stared at her. Her tone of voice was not all what he was used to. It was not brisk, crisp, and stern. It was low and anxious and somewhat much more human than usual. Misbehavior is dollars Umbridge class would cost you much more than house pointing and detention. What do you? Potter, use your common sense, snapped Professor McGonagall with an abrupt return to her usual manner. You know where she comes from. You must know to whom she is reporting. The bell rang for the end of the lesson overhead, and all round from the elephantine sound of hundreds of students on the move. It says she's giving detention every evening this week, starting tomorrow. Professor McNamara said, looking down in Umbridge's note again. Every evening this week, Harry repeated, horrible, but Professor, couldn't you? No, I couldn't, said Professor McNamara flatly, but she's your teacher and has every right to give you detention. You will go to her room at 5 o'clock tomorrow at the first one. Just remember, tread careful around dollars Umbridge. But I was telling the truth, said Harry, outraged. Voldemort's back, you know he is. Professor Dumbledore knows he is. For heaven's sake, Potter, said Professor McGonagall, straightening her glass angrily. She had wings horrible when she had used Voldemort's name. Do you really think this is about truth or lies? It's about keeping your head down and your temper under control. She stood up, nostril wide and mouth very thin, and she stood too. Have another biscuit, she said irritably, thrusting the tin at him. No thanks, said Harry coldly. Don't be ridiculous, she snapped. He took one. Thanks, he said grudgingly. Didn't you listen to Dollar's Umbridge's speech at the start of term, Fish Potter? Yes, said Harry. Yeah, but she said progress will be prohibited, or will be that the Ministry of Magic is trying to interfere at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall eyed at him for a moment, then sniffed walk around her desk and opened the door for him. Well, I'm glad you listened to Hermione Granger at any rate, she said, pointing him out of her office. That's it for today. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for next chapter. Till then, see you. Bye bye.